The Price of Fame: How Success Destroyed Paul Hogan's First Family. Behind every success story lies a trail of casualties, and few tales illustrate this brutal truth more devastatingly than the destruction of Paul Hogan's first family. This is the dark, untold story of how one man's rise to international stardom became a family's descent into abandonment, betrayal, and irreparable damage that would echo through generations. When Paul Hogan stepped onto that fateful Crocodile Dundee set he wasn't just beginning the role that would make him a global icon. He was writing the death warrant for a 30-year marriage and condemning 5 children to lives forever scarred by their father's choice to pursue fame over family, romance over responsibility, and personal gratification over parental duty. This is the brutal examination of how success can become a weapon that destroys everything it was supposedly meant to protect. It's the story of Noelene Edwards, the devoted wife who supported Paul through decades of struggle only to be discarded the moment he achieved the success she had helped him build. It's the story of 5 children who watched their father transform from beloved parent to absent celebrity, too intoxicated by fame and new love to remember the family that had sustained him through his years of obscurity. Most important, it's the story of how the entertainment industry's worship of success enables and even celebrates the destruction of families, turning personal tragedy into tabloid entertainment and teaching millions that fame justifies any betrayal, any abandonment, any sacrifice of those who love you most. Chapter 1: The Foundation of Deception. The marriage of Paul Hogan and Noelene Edwards began in 1958 with all the promise and innocence that young love could offer. Paul was just 19 years old, working as a rigger on the Sydney Harbor Bridge, earning honest wages for honest work while dreaming of something bigger than his current circumstances could provide. Noelene was the woman who believed in those dreams when no one else did, who saw potential in the rough-around-the-edges bridge worker when the rest of the world saw only another blue-collar Australian without prospects or ambition. Together they weathered life's hardships, building a simple home and raising 5 children. But this understated description cannot capture the profound sacrifice and dedication that Noelene poured into supporting Paul's unlikely journey from manual laborer to entertainment professional. She wasn't just a wife, she was the foundation upon which every subsequent achievement would be built. The early years of their marriage were characterized by the kind of financial struggle that tests relationships to their breaking point. Paul's bridge work provided barely enough income to support a growing family, and his early attempts at entertainment career development often meant additional financial strain as he invested time and energy in pursuits that might never generate income. Noelene's role during these crucial years went far beyond traditional housework and childcare. She managed the family finances with the skill of a professional accountant, stretching every dollar to cover necessities while somehow finding resources to support Paul's creative ambition. She arranged her own work schedule around his entertainment activities, ensuring that childcare was always covered and family responsibilities never interfered with his opportunity. The 5 children who became the heart of the Hogan family, each representing years of shared hope, struggle, and mutual commitment, grew up watching their mother provide the stability and emotional support that allowed their father to pursue increasingly demanding career goals. From their perspective, family life meant watching mom hold everything together while dad chased dreams that seemed important to him but distant from their daily experience. We knew Noelene. We would see them sitting together at the Logies, and she'd be laughing at his jokes, and they seemed like the perfect family, observed industry insiders who witnessed the public face of the Hogan marriage during Paul's early television success. But this perfect family image was built on Noelene's talent for supporting her husband's career while hiding the growing personal costs of his increasing fame and the changes it was creating in their relationship. The success of The Paul Hogan Show represented the realization of dreams that Noelene had supported through years of uncertainty and sacrifice. Finally, her faith in Paul's potential was being validated by public recognition and financial security that would benefit their entire family. But success also brought new pressures and temptations that would test their marriage in ways that poverty and struggle never had. The transformation that began with Paul's television success was subtle at first: longer hours, more travel, increased social obligations, and the gradual intrusion of industry relationships into family life. Noelene found herself sharing her husband with an ever-expanding circle of professional colleagues, entertainment industry figures, and fans who demanded his time and attention. The children began to experience their father's success as absence rather than achievement. The man who had once been present for family meals, school events, and ordinary daily interactions was increasingly occupied with career obligations that took him away from home and family with growing frequency. Most devastatingly, Paul began to change in ways that suggested his increasing success was altering his values, priorities, and understanding of what mattered most in life. The humble bridge worker who had been grateful for Noelene's support and partnership was gradually being replaced by a celebrity who took her sacrifices for granted while pursuing opportunities and relationships that had nothing to do with the family that had sustained him through his years of struggle. The foundation that Noelene had so carefully built, based on mutual support, shared sacrifice, and commitment to family above all else, was being systematically undermined by the very success it had made possible. The bitter irony was becoming clear. The dreams she had helped Paul achieve were destroying the relationship that had made those achievements possible. Chapter 2: The Moment Everything Changed. The year 1985 marked the beginning of the end for the Hogan family as they had known it for nearly 3 decades. When Paul was cast as the lead in Crocodile Dundee, it seemed like the ultimate validation of everything Noelene had sacrificed and supported throughout their marriage. Finally, her husband would achieve the international recognition that his talent deserved. What she didn't anticipate was that this success would come with a price that would destroy everything she had worked to build and protect. The moment Paul laid eyes on Linda Kozlowski on the Crocodile Dundee set, the marriage that had survived poverty, struggle, and the early pressures of entertainment industry success began its inexorable collapse. I knew I was in trouble from the moment I laid eyes on her. Linda was smart, beautiful, utterly irresistible, Paul would later admit, but this confession came far too late to matter to the woman whose life he was about to destroy. The attraction between Paul and Linda was immediate, undeniable, and completely incompatible with the family obligations that Paul had accumulated during his 30 years of marriage to Noelene. But rather than recognizing this attraction as a threat to his family and taking steps to protect the people who had supported him through decades of struggle, Paul chose to pursue feelings that would prove more powerful than his sense of duty, loyalty, or paternal responsibility. When we acted together, everything felt so natural that I forgot I was in front of a camera. Linda later reflected about her connection with Paul, unknowingly describing the beginning of a relationship that would leave 5 children without their father's full attention and one devoted wife facing the destruction of everything she had built her life around. The professional requirements of filming Crocodile Dundee provided convenient cover for Paul and Linda's developing relationship. Long days on location, intimate scenes that required emotional connection, and the intensity of creative collaboration created opportunities for private interaction that would have been impossible to justify under normal circumstances. Both Paul and Linda insisted that their romance only blossomed after his marriage to Noelene had begun to fall apart, but this convenient narrative ignores the fundamental reality that Paul's marriage began falling apart precisely because he was investing his emotional energy in another relationship rather than working to strengthen the partnership that had sustained him for 3 decades. The transformation that occurred in Paul during the filming of Crocodile Dundee was visible to family members who suddenly found themselves competing for attention with a project and a woman who clearly meant more to Paul than his existing obligation. Phone calls home became shorter and less frequent. Visits between location filming became rushed and distracted. The enthusiastic husband and father who had shared his professional excitement with his family was replaced by someone whose primary emotional investment lay elsewhere. Noelene's first awareness that something fundamental had changed in her marriage came not through direct confrontation or honest conversation, but through the gradual realization that she was no longer her husband's primary emotional focus. The man who had once shared everything with her was becoming increasingly private about his work, his colleagues, and his feelings about the project that was consuming more and more of his time and attention. The children began to notice changes in their father that they were too young to understand but old enough to feel. The parent who had once been fully present during family time was increasingly preoccupied, distant and eager to return to work obligations that seemed more compelling than family relationships that had once been his highest priority. It was hard for all my kids then, thrust into a limelight that they didn't invite, Paul later acknowledged, but this admission fails to capture the additional trauma of watching their father's emotional investment shift from family to career to a new relationship that threatened everything they had previously understood about their family's stability and future. The success of Crocodile Dundee, which should have been a celebration shared by the entire family who had supported Paul's career journey, instead became the backdrop for the most devastating betrayal of Noelene's life. The dreams she had supported and the success she had helped create were being used to justify her replacement by a younger, more exciting woman who had contributed nothing to Paul's development but who would benefit from everything Noelene had sacrificed to make possible. The bitter irony was inescapable. The role that made Paul internationally famous was the one that taught him to betray the people who loved him most completely and permanently. Chapter 3: The Cruelest Betrayal. What made Paul Hogan's abandonment of his first family particularly devastating was not just the fact of his infidelity but the calculated, systematic way he went about destroying a 30-year partnership while presenting himself as the victim of circumstances beyond his control. This was not a moment of weakness or a temporary lapse in judgment. This was a deliberate campaign to replace one life with another while avoiding accountability for the destruction left in his wake. The first divorce in 1981, 5 years before Paul met Linda, had been a warning sign that Noelene either didn't recognize or chose to ignore. After more than 2 decades of marriage, Paul had briefly walked away from his family only to return a year later with promises of renewed commitment and dedication to their partnership. Noelene's decision to remarry Paul in 1982 demonstrated the depth of her love and her faith in the possibility of redemption. In 1981, after more than 2 decades together, they had parted ways only to remarry a year later, but this reconciliation, which should have strengthened their bond and confirmed their commitment to each other, instead provided Paul with practice in abandoning his family and confidence that he could escape the consequences of his betrayal. When Paul chose to file for divorce a second time in 1986, just as Crocodile Dundee was becoming an international sensation, the timing made his motivations unmistakably clear. This was not about marital problems that had developed gradually over time. This was about Paul's desire to trade his existing family for a newer, more exciting model that better suited his transformed circumstances and elevated self-image. Many believe that his relationship with the young actress was the final straw, but this characterization minimizes the calculated nature of Paul's decision-making. The relationship with Linda wasn't the final straw that broke an already damaged marriage. It was the prize that Paul was willing to destroy his family to obtain. The media coverage that followed Paul's abandonment of his family was brutal but accurate. Paul Hogan leaves wife for on-screen lover and national icon exposed as a cheater captured the essential truth about a man who was willing to sacrifice everyone who had supported him for a woman he had known for less than 2 years. Linda Kozlowski, once an unknown actress, suddenly became the target of relentless public scorn. She was branded the other woman and a homewrecker, but the real villain of this story was not the young actress who fell in love with a married man, but the husband and father who chose to pursue that love regardless of the cost to his existing family. The outrage only intensified when it became known that while Noelene was left to raise 5 children alone, Paul and Linda were appearing together at major events. They walked hand in hand on red carpets, smiling brightly for the cameras, seemingly unfazed by the backlash, demonstrating Paul's complete lack of shame or regret about the family he had destroyed in pursuit of his new relationship. The children who had once been Paul's pride and joy were suddenly transformed into obstacles to his new happiness. The pain cut deeper when he realized Linda didn't care for them at all. She was absent from family gatherings, absent from calls from Australia. Only an old man's voice would answer, revealing that Paul had chosen a woman who had no interest in the children who were the most important part of his previous life. Rumors spread across Sydney, Melbourne, and eventually crossed the Pacific to Hollywood. Paul Hogan has forgotten his role as a father because of Linda, but these weren't rumors. They were accurate observations about a man who had chosen romantic fulfillment over parental responsibility. Australian newspapers harshly criticized Linda as the reason behind the Hogan family's collapse. They used heavy words. The outsider who broke the home, a woman who didn't know how to care for a family, but this criticism was misdirected. Linda was a symptom, not a cause. The real destroyer of the Hogan family was Paul himself, who had decided that his personal happiness was more important than his obligations to the people who had loved and supported him for decades. Despite Paul's efforts to make up for the past, the distance between him and his children only grew wider because his efforts were half-hearted attempts to maintain relationships with children while prioritizing the woman who had no interest in being part of a blended family or sharing Paul's attention with anyone else. The cruelest aspect of Paul's betrayal was his refusal to acknowledge what he had done. Instead of admitting that he had chosen Linda over his family, he presented the situation as a tragic conflict between two equally valid loves, as if his family's destruction was an unfortunate side effect rather than a deliberate choice he had made repeatedly and systematically over several years. Chapter 4: The Children's Silent Suffering. The 5 Hogan children, the innocent casualties of their father's midlife reinvention, experienced the destruction of their family as a slow-motion catastrophe that unfolded over years, leaving each of them to cope with abandonment, confusion, and the realization that they had been deemed less important than their father's new romantic obsession. The children's ages during the crisis made their suffering particularly acute. These were not small children who might have been too young to understand what was happening, nor were they fully independent adults who could process their father's choices with mature perspective. They were teenagers and young adults who had built their identities around being part of the Hogan family, only to discover that their father was systematically dismantling everything they had believed was permanent and secure. It was hard for all my kids then, thrust into a limelight that they didn't invite, Paul later acknowledged, but this characterization completely misses the real source of their trauma. The children weren't suffering because of media attention. They were suffering because their father had chosen to abandon them for another woman and was trying to justify his abandonment as unavoidable circumstance rather than deliberate choice. The first day we changed school, I got hauled up by the teacher and made to stand up in front of everyone and told I wasn't going to be specially treated. So obviously I was already being specially treated for not doing anything. Recalled one of Paul's children about the social consequences of their father's celebrity and scandal, demonstrating how Paul's choices created humiliation and difficulty for family members who had no say in the decisions that were affecting their daily life. And so I hated that. And then everything became, oh, is he really your father? And blah, blah. Capturing the way that Paul's scandal transformed his children's school experiences from normal teenage social navigation into constant interrogation about their family's dysfunction and their father's public behavior. The children's perspective on their father's transformation from beloved parent to absent celebrity was devastating and permanent. The man who had once been fully present and emotionally available to them was gradually replaced by someone whose primary emotional investments lay elsewhere and whose time with them felt increasingly obligatory rather than joyful. From what I saw, he maintained a very normal household, as did Noelene, and so even though Noelene would love to go to the logies and all the special events, they didn't seek the limelight. It was more about family. One child reflected about their pre-scandal family life, highlighting the contrast between the family-centered values that had once guided their father and the celebrity-obsessed priorities that took over after his success. The children's relationship with Linda, their father's new romantic priority, was characterized by mutual discomfort and barely concealed hostility. They recognized that she had no genuine interest in them as individuals, and that her presence in their father's life meant less attention, affection, and emotional investment for them. Paul's children from his first marriage refused to accept Linda. During family reunions in Sydney or Los Angeles, the atmosphere was suffocating. One child even said bluntly, "You abandoned us for a woman we barely know," demonstrating the children's clear understanding of what had happened to their family and their unwillingness to pretend that Linda's role in their father's life was acceptable or beneficial to them. The long-term impact of their father's abandonment shaped the children's approach to relationships, commitment, and trust in ways that would affect them for the rest of their lives. Watching their father discard a 30-year marriage and 5 children for a newer, more exciting option taught them lessons about the fragility of love and the unreliability of parental commitment, that no amount of subsequent contact or financial support could and they've always all had very real jobs, and showbiz has been this crazy thing Dad does from time to time, noted industry observers about the practical, grounded approach that Paul's children took to their own career, as if they had consciously chosen to avoid the industry that had corrupted their father and destroyed their family. The children's emotional maturity in handling their father's betrayal was both impressive and heartbreaking. Rather than creating public scenes or demanding media attention to tell their side of the story, they maintained dignity and privacy while processing the destruction of everything they had believed about family loyalty and parental. The financial support that Paul provided to his children after his abandonment of their family was interpreted by them not as generosity or continued love, but as evidence of his guilt and his attempt to purchase forgiveness for choices that had caused irreparable emotional damage. Most devastatingly, the children learned to live with the knowledge that their father had chosen another woman over them, that no amount of subsequent contact or expressions of affection could change the fundamental reality that when forced to choose between his existing family and his new romantic relationship, he had chosen the relationship without hesitation or apparent regret. Chapter 5: Noelene's Devastation. The destruction of Noelene Edwards' life represents one of the most heartbreaking examples of how a devoted partner can be discarded and forgotten once their surescence to a celebrity spouse has ended. After 30 years of marriage, 5 children, and countless sacrifices to support Paul's career aspirations, Noelene found herself treated as an obstacle to be removed rather than a partner to be honored. The woman who had supported Paul through his years as an unknown bridgeworker, who had believed in his entertainment potential when no one else did, who had managed family responsibilities so that he could pursue increasingly demanding career opportunities, was suddenly informed that her decades of dedication had been rendered worthless by his attraction to a younger actress who offered excitement rather than stability, novelty rather than depth. Together they weathered life's hardships, building a simple home and raising 5 children. In the eyes of the public, the Hogan family symbolized a lasting marriage where a devoted husband and a selfless wife stood by each other through thick and thin, but this public image, which had taken decades to build and maintain, was destroyed in less than 2 years by Paul's decision to pursue personal gratification over family commitment. The timeline of Noelene's abandonment reveals the calculated cruelty of Paul's decision-making. Rather than honestly confronting the problems in their marriage or working to strengthen their partnership, Paul chose to invest his emotional energy in developing a relationship with another woman while maintaining the facade of commitment to his existing family until he was ready to make the transition complete. However, everything changed in 1985 when Paul landed the lead role in Crocodile Dundee. It was on the set of this iconic film that Paul met Linda Kozlowski, a young American actress 19 years his junior, marking the beginning of the end for a woman whose only crime was loving and supporting a man who proved incapable of honoring those sacrifices once better options became available. The first indication that Noelene's marriage was in serious jeopardy came not through honest conversation or direct confrontation, but through the gradual realization that her husband's emotional investment had shifted to someone else. The man who had once shared his professional excitement and personal concerns with her was becoming increasingly private and distant.
We knew Noelene. We would see them sitting together at the lodges and she'd be laughing at his jokes, and they seemed like the perfect family, observed industry insiders who witnessed Noelene's continued efforts to support Paul's career even as he was systematically destroying their marriage behind the scenes. The public humiliation that accompanied Paul's abandonment of Noelene was deliberately cruel. Rather than handling their separation privately or attempting to minimize the damage to his family's reputation, Paul flaunted his new relationship in ways that maximized Noelene's embarrassment and the children's social difficulties. The Australian media, once proud to call Paul a national treasure, did not miss the opportunity to exploit the drama. Tabloids were flooded with sensational headlines: Paul Hogan leaves wife for on-screen lover, and national icon exposed as a cheater, creating a media circus that transformed Noelene's private pain into public entertainment. The divorce proceedings revealed the extent to which Noelene had subordinated her own interests to Paul's career development. She had no independent income, no separate professional identity, and no financial resources beyond what Paul chose to provide. After 30 years of marriage, she was essentially starting over at an age when most people are planning for retirement. While Noelene was left to raise 5 children alone, Paul and Linda were appearing together at major events. They walked hand in hand on red carpets, smiling brightly for the cameras, seemingly unfazed by the backlash, demonstrating Paul's complete indifference to the impact of his choices on the woman who had sacrificed everything to support his success. The children's loyalty to their mother provided some comfort during Noelene's darkest period, but it also meant that she bore the additional burden of trying to help them process their father's abandonment while dealing with her own devastation and the practical challenges of rebuilding her life from scratch. The long-term consequences of Paul's abandonment shaped Noelene's remaining years in ways that no amount of financial support could address. The woman who had once been part of a partnership that seemed unbreakable was forced to reconstruct her identity, her social connections, and her understanding of what love and commitment actually meant. Most heartbreakingly, Noelene had to live with the knowledge that the man she had loved and supported for 3 decades had found her so easily replaceable that he was willing to destroy everything they had built together for a relationship with a woman he had known for less than 2 years. Epilogue: The casualties of stardom. As Paul Hogan approaches the end of his life, surrounded by the wealth and recognition that his entertainment career provided, the true cost of his success becomes impossible to ignore. The bridge worker who became a global icon built his achievements on a foundation of destroyed relationships, abandoned children, and the systematic betrayal of everyone who had supported him during his years of obscurity and struggle. I gave up an entire lifetime only to end up living like a shadow in my own home, Paul reflected in his later years, but this self-pity completely ignores the lifetimes he destroyed in other people. The devoted wife who was discarded after 30 years of sacrifice, the 5 children who learned that parental love was conditional and could be withdrawn without warning, and the family relationships that could never be repaired or restored. The Venice beach house where Paul now lives alone serves as a monument to choices that prioritize temporary excitement over permanent relationships, romantic gratification over family responsibility, and personal satisfaction over moral obligation. Every empty room echoes with the laughter of children who once believed their father loved them unconditionally, and every silence reminds him of conversations he chose not to have and relationships he decided not to maintain. The children who survived their father's abandonment grew into adults who learned to protect themselves by limiting their emotional investment in relationships that might disappear without warning. They built careers in fields far from entertainment, created families with different values, and developed identities that didn't depend on their father's approval or presence. Noelene Edwards, the woman who supported Paul through his transformation from bridge worker to global celebrity, spent her remaining years rebuilding an identity and a life that had been completely destroyed by her husband's decision to trade their 30-year partnership for a younger woman's attention and affection. The entertainment industry that celebrated Paul's success while ignoring the human cost of his achievements continues to promote and reward similar behavior, teaching new generations of artists that fame justifies any personal choices and that the destruction of family relationships is acceptable collateral damage in the pursuit of career success. The Australian culture that once proudly claimed Paul as a national treasure learned to overlook the moral implications of his choices because his international success reflected well on the country's entertainment capability. The message was clear: achievement excuses betrayal, success justifies abandonment, and fame makes any behavior acceptable. The legacy that Paul leaves behind is not just his entertainment achievements or his contribution to Australian culture, but also the permanent damage he inflicted on people who had no choice in his decisions but were forced to live with their consequences for the rest of their lives. The bridge worker who learned to build connections between structures never learned to maintain connections between people. The entertainer who made millions laugh brought decades of tears to the people who loved him most. The global icon who represented Australian values to the world completely abandoned those values when they conflicted with his personal desire. The price of Paul Hogan's fame was paid not by him but by the innocent people who trusted him, supported him, and loved him completely, only to discover that their love and trust meant less to him than the excitement of new opportunities and younger relationships. That price can never be repaid, never be justified, and never be forgotten by those who were forced to pay it without their consent or understanding.